You're listening to ThunderQuack Podcast Network.
Hello and welcome back to Off the Record, your Patreon exclusive ThunderQuack podcast. I'm your host, Michael Cohen, and once again, this is a non-exclusive exclusive episode, not just on Patreon, but on the regular podcast feed. So if you're subscribed to the ThunderQuack podcast feed and you're wondering what is this is the podcast that is usually our Patreon exclusive episode, and because we've moved to the weekly format, I've decided that in the month of March, to celebrate, we're gonna just put these out on the regular feed for everybody to listen to. So I hope that you guys are enjoying it. Hope that it's of some value, and that when this ends at the end of March, you decide to maybe go check out patreon.com/ThunderQuack. And support us over there and continue to get access to Off the Record. But in the meantime, here we are. You've got it. This episode, man. So I had a bunch of stuff planned for Off the Record that I was gonna do over the course of the next few weeks, and yet I have had the opportunity to watch nothing. I watched a movie specifically for Perfect 10. It's a great episode, by the way. That'll be out next week, or it's out this week if you're listening on the podcast feed. But if you're a Patreon supporter and getting this a week early, then the episode for Upgrade with Jim Mello is out next week. And it's fantastic. It is a great episode. What a movie, and also just an awesome conversation with Jim. My first time podcasting with him, so it was a bit of a coin toss, but it came up. It came up a winner. So I hope you guys check that out. I'm looking forward to everybody listening to it. If you haven't seen the movie Upgrade, go watch it. Starring Logan Marshall Green. But just a heads up, it is a little intense. It is violent. It is gory. Although it looks on the outside like, if you watch the trailer, it looks like a pretty standard action movie. It is directed by Lee Winnell, and Winnell is a horror director, writer, primarily. So, take that into consideration before you check it out. But it was a really fun movie to watch, as long as you don't mind a little bit of the old ultra violence. But I found it enjoyable. But our conversation on Perfect 10 is going to be it's a fantastic one that I think that you guys will enjoy listening to. So go check that out when that drops. But other than that, I really haven't gotten the opportunity to watch much else other than I finished off Dragon Ball Super, which Joe and I talked about at length on the most recent episode of the ThunderQuack podcast in our tribute to Akira Toriyama. So I can't really talk about that. We've been talking about Bad Batch on Rebel Cells, but I watched those episodes quite a while ago when we got our screeners, so that's not new. The only other thing that I've really been consuming as of late is X-Men. Trying to binge through that before X-Men 97, which is in 1 week. So it's I guess I can talk about that. I'll talk about that. Yeah, and then the other thing that I've been doing is playing a lot of video games in the time that I do have. So it's just been a crazy few weeks. It's going to be a crazy another couple of weeks. Hopefully after that it'll ease up a little bit and I'll have some time to sit down and watch Avatar. I'd really like to watch Avatar all the way through, but I just haven't had the dedicated time for it. The great thing about X-Men is that I have already seen most of it. I'm pretty sure all of it, and as I watch through it, I'm like, yeah, okay, I've seen all these episodes. So I'm most of the way through season 2, and I am positive that I've seen all of it so far. And I looked through the rest of the episodes, and I'm like, okay, yeah, all of this is very familiar. But I expect that there are a few towards the end, towards the the end of the final season that maybe I haven't seen, or at least I haven't seen in a long time since it aired. So I'm making my way through that, but I can be doing other things. Although, I mean, like Dragon Ball Super, I primarily watched while doing other things. I actually find that if I'm not occupied, I don't pay attention to Dragon Ball Super, or Dragon Ball Z, Dragon Ball in general. I need to be like cooking or doing the dishes or something like that. And then I can kind of like balance the two things at once. But if I just dedicate time to sit and watch Dragon Ball, I tend to just zone out. Or I'll go on my phone and I'll be distracted by something else. But the funny thing is that like washing dishes and cooking is autopilot for me, right? So I in that space, it's like then I can give my actual brain attention to whatever it is that I'm watching. So that's how I consume the majority of Dragon Ball Super. And then like, you know, like when it gets to a really cool part, I basically stop and watch it. But a lot of the like back and forth dialogue and stuff, you really don't need to be looking at the screen because you can imagine it. You can picture what's happening. X-Men, very similar, very very similar, especially because I've already seen all of it. So yeah, it's been a just sort of background noise viewing experience to try and get through it, to try and get to the final season really, so that I can watch that and be ready for X-Men 97. So I don't have a lot of time left, but I think I can do it. But I do have a couple of takeaways thus far. One of them, I might get roasted for this. It's actually better in our memories. I think this is one of those like nostalgia pieces that it definitely has high highs. Like I think when the show is working really well, it's great, but it also it's an early 90s Saturday morning cartoon based on a comic book, and the source material that it's drawing from is so strong. Because we're talking about mostly the Claremont stuff from the X-Men, from sort of like the late 70s, 80s into the early 90s, right? We're talking about stuff like Dark Phoenix and, the entire Phoenix saga, Phoenix, Dark Phoenix, Hellfire Club, all of that stuff. We're talking about the Legacy Virus and Master Mold and Savage Land, and you know, like this is like the bread and butter of the X-Men, and this like that's when we see the movies and stuff like that, Days of Future Past, whatnot, that's where it's pulling from, right? Those are the stories that it's pulling from. So the strength of that source material is so much so that it the show can be kind of middling and still come out on top, because the stories themselves are very compelling, but the execution at times leaves a little bit wanting. The Morlock episode is one that I thought I remembered so vividly, and then I watched it and it was like, oh, that's all it was? It's very brief. Like all of the conflict between Storm and Callisto is like, man, it runs maybe 4 minutes of the episode. It is not like this lengthy drawn out thing, and the setting is not as epic or intense as I remembered it being, and certainly the animation is not what it is in my mind's eye. When I think about this show in my mind's eye, it looks like the new one. It looks like X-Men 97, right? Not CG, so not quite as perfect, but like in terms of like dynamism and sort of the action and framing and stuff like that. In practice, my goodness, it can be very rough. The writing is also It feels like they took the comics and they just like edited them down into as little dialogue as possible. So you get a lot of like just one-liners coming out of nowhere. Everybody's got a pun. Everybody has something, especially like Wolverine, Jubilee, and Gambit, like especially those three characters. And then every time Storm goes to do something, she has to summon the powers of nature and yada yada. Like she just, it's very over the top. The whole thing is super melodramatic. It is not as good as I remember it. The funny thing is that a few years ago, trying to remember which kid it was. I guess it would have been Cassie because it would have been 2019. It would have been when Disney Plus launched. And Spider-Man the animated series was on there. That I'd be up in the middle of the night. Yeah, I'm sure it was Cassie. I'd be up in the middle of the night with her, as you are with a newborn, and I would throw on some Spider-Man and watch that. And so I watched through quite a bit, actually. I think I got through like at least 2 seasons of that in that time period. And I can remember watching it going like, this show was actually really good. The animation was sort of choppier than I remembered it being. And they haven't done like a proper remaster. I don't even know if it's possible, like what the masters look like on that show. But they haven't retouched it at all. They haven't gone back and like remastered it at all. So it looks awful on Disney Plus. But in terms of like voice performance, music, story, like that is all there. And then to watch X-Men, and I think that maybe in later seasons it'll clean up a little bit maybe, but that the first 2 seasons, it is not as good as I think we all kind of collectively agree that it was. I do think, I feel like nostalgia is really, really coloring that perspective. The other thing that I find really interesting is that our generation really has this thing against Cyclops, right? Scott Summers, he's a jerk, right? That's everybody's opinion of him. It is not my opinion of him. I quite like Cyclops. He is my favorite X-Man, and that's something that I don't know. It was okay. So it's something that when I was watching this show as a kid, I liked him. Obviously we all liked Wolverine because Wolverine is Wolverine, and there's just something about that character, the attitude, the claws, the look, just all of it, right? But I can remember creating my own characters back before the internet existed and we had OCs and all of that sort of thing. But I would create my own characters for whatever thing that I was watching, right? Whether it's Power Rangers or X-Men or Sonic or what have you, right? But the character that I created was based off of Cyclops, like that, and I think a lot of it was like the look. I just really like that 90s Cyclops with the sort of half mask and his hair, well coiffed on the top of it, and just looking good like that. There's something about that I've always really, really loved that design, the belts and pockets and the Jim Lee of it all. But I had created, I think the character was called Eagle Eye, which is really funny. So he had like a bird motif, but shot lasers out of his eyes in the same way that, I mean, Cyclops doesn't shoot lasers. Don't come after me, but you know what I mean. And I'll tell you where it came from. I'll tell you how I came to that. We had a Nerf gun called an Eagle Eye that was like the first Nerf gun that had like a red dot laser on it, and it was not a laser. What it was an LED that shone through a red magnifying glass, and that magnifying glass would create like a pinpoint of red light that you could only see in a pitch black room. It's totally pointless. Yeah, and also, I don't know if you are aware of this, but Nerf darts not famous for their accuracy. So that red dot laser sight, completely useless, but it looked real cool. It looked rad, and it was like all silver and black with this red dot laser, and it was called the Eagle Eye, and so I kind of taken inspiration from that and created. And there's a little bit of like a Power Rangers aesthetic as well. So the character, I wish I could find these drawings. I am sure that I have at least 1 or 2 somewhere, because I'm sure that I drew this character in like my journal or something at school. But because we would do our journaling every morning. in like third grade, right? And it was the books that were split in half. Like the bottom half was lined, so you would write your story in there, and then the top half was blank, so you would draw your picture to go along with it. So I'm positive that I drew Eagle Eye at least once in one of those, and like my mom kept all that stuff. So so somewhere there's a drawing of Eagle Eye, but essentially it looked kind of like Cyclops. This is the thing, is that Cyclops and Jean have like all these kids from different timelines that all travel back in time and that sort of thing. So I knew some of this stuff, so I had kind of crafted this character with that idea that he was like Cable or X-Man or whoever, Rachel Summers, like all these characters. So he had a little bit of, I think he had a little bit of the Cable aesthetic as well, of like the bandoliers. I mean, everybody did. That was just the style at the time. And I think I gave him the middle arms. Like Cable, but he wasn't as bulky. He wasn't as like big and muscly. But the thing that made him Eagle Eye, first off, I gave him wings. Because why wouldn't you? And so I gave him a visor like Cyclops, but stylized like a bird beak, like an eagle beak, which was a little bit inspired by Power Rangers. It was kind of Power Rangers-esque as well. So yeah, like that that was sort of my touchstone with Cyclops back then, was through that character. But then as an adult reading X-Men comics, I eventually came to really appreciate the character of Cyclops, particularly because of Avengers versus X-Men. And I've talked about this on a bunch of podcasts in the past, so I won't go too deep into it. You can actually hear me talk at length about Avengers versus X-Men on the Pullbox podcast. There's an old episode of that, because that's where I read it initially, was as part of that. And obviously Cyclops as the leader of the X-Men. This is in the period of time when they are in San Francisco. So the X-Men have left Westchester and moved to San Francisco, and they've got I think they take over Alcatraz or something like that. And so they're on this island, and they've got sort of their whole deal. And the Phoenix Force is coming back, right? So we get word via some cosmic characters. I can't remember exactly which ones. I think maybe Nova. That the Phoenix Force is on its way back to Earth. Can never get rid of it, right? It always comes back. Jean is long dead at this point. But yeah, like this is happening. It's coming, and so it's going to come back to Earth, and it's going to pick a host. And the expectation is that it's this character, Hope Summers, who Hope was. So a couple of things happen, right? The Age of Apocalypse stuff happens as a result of, or sorry, not Age of Apocalypse. Age of Apocalypse happens way before this. House of M happens, and in House of M, obviously, for those who don't know, in House of M, Wanda Maximoff, Scarlet Witch, she uses her powers and she says no more mutants, and when she does, in House of M, there are no there are very few mutant characters, and it's a whole thing. Alternate reality, alternate timeline, right? But then post House of M, come back to the 616 universe, and most of the mutants have been wiped out. I don't know if they were like killed, because I wasn't reading this stuff at that time. Just sort of like casually aware of it. So I don't remember if it's like, oh, they like everybody died, or I think like a lot of characters, a lot of people that had been X-Men or mutants were just normal humans. And so there were very few X-Men, and this led into a storyline called Endangered Species, which was when I started reading X-Men comics again, sort of in the modern era. And this was essentially a storyline where Beast, Hank McCoy, was trying to figure out, like what caused a bunch of things, and how to save the mutant race, right? And in the process, or not in the process necessarily, but so I'm trying to remember if House of M comes before or after Civil War. I think it comes before Civil War, and then Civil War happens. So after Civil War, because Civil War, it's instigated by a mutant who basically like explodes and levels a town, right? Mutants are basically outlawed as a result of Civil War, as a result of the Superhuman Registration Act. So this is like sort of one of the things that the X-Men had been fighting against forever was mutant registration. And then it eventually does happen by way of the Superhuman Registration Act, right? Which is not just them; it's anybody with meta-human powers. But there are some who take advantage of this, the Friends of Humanity and whatnot. They use it in the way that they always intended to use the Mutant Registration Act. So mutants are basically being hunted down, and there are very few left anyways, and no new mutants are being born. Like it's been forever since a mutant was born, because of Wanda's sort of wish that she enacted. And then it happens, and one is born, and her name is Hope. And she's born. It's sort of like I think it was like sort of prophesied almost that she would be born, or like it was like expected. There were people. It might have been time travel stuff of like people coming back to like hunt her. But Cable shows up, rescues the kid. X-Force is a part of that, which is his Wolverine's X-Force, which is like the murdery X-Force. It's his wet work Black Ops team. So yeah, like Wolverine, Deadpool, Warpath, Domino, a few other characters are involved in this story. And Cable, after Hope is born, Cable takes her and disappears into the time stream, right? Like to train her. And the next time that we see Hope, she's like a teenager, and Cable has raised this girl, and we're sort of just waiting for her mutant powers to manifest. And then they kind of do, and it's sort of Phoenix-ish. I mean, this is the thing. She's got red hair. She's it's comics, so everybody kind of looks the same no matter what. But she's basically a dead ringer for Jean Grey, who has been dead forever, and so eventually she becomes Hope Summers, and in Avengers vs. X-Men, the expectation is that the Phoenix is coming for her, because the thought is at this point that she's essentially the reincarnation of Jean. And that's why she's the first mutant born in a generation, sort of thing. That it's like the Phoenix Force, essentially, like the latent power of the Phoenix Force that was connected to Jean, that may or may not have like rebirthed her abilities in this kid who is a dead ringer for her, and all of this stuff. So Hope is like a teenager at this point. She's in the regular timeline, in the present timeline, and everybody's like, okay, the Phoenix Force is coming. And Scott is basically like, we're going to train you. We're going to train you to embrace the Phoenix. And then we're going to use the Phoenix Force, the power of rebirth, to restore mutants to the timeline, essentially, right? Like undo what Wanda did. That's Scott's plan. The Avengers, however, with the let's say the urging of Hank and Wolverine, of Beast and Wolverine, who are both Avengers, they're like, okay, we have to stop this. And so they show up on this, like on Alcatraz, I think it is, that the X-Men are on, their base. And basically Captain America comes down to meet Scott on the beach. He jumps out of a helicarrier to do it. And he gets there and he's like, we need to take Hope. And Scott's like, over my dead body. It's not happening. And they have a whole back and forth, and Steve Rogers is like, I'm here to help. Like, that's like this is doesn't have to be a fight. This doesn't have to be an argument. I want to help. The Avengers are here to help. At which point Scott just like lays into him and is like, you're here to help. Like, where were you when, like Genosha happened, or like the Mutant Registration Act, or like any of these things, these struggles that we've fought through? The Avengers have never been there before for mutants. They've never been there before for the X-Men. Now all of a sudden you're here because you're threatened, right? He's like, get off my island. And it was that, this is like the beginning of Avengers versus X-Men. It's very, very early in it. It was at that moment that I was like, oh God, I love Cyclops. I just sort of like fell back in love with the character. And then he goes through that, and he eventually becomes the villain through the course of that story. But not. I mean, like, he makes the choice. He embraces the Phoenix, and then the Phoenix kind of drives him mad, and he ends up taking the. So what happens is the Phoenix shows up, and when the Phoenix shows up, it's supposed to go into Hope, but it doesn't go into Hope. Hope, who has been training with Iron Fist in order to learn to control the Phoenix Force when it shows up, because eventually she ends up with the Avengers. But it doesn't end up going into Hope. It ends up splitting into 5 and going into Scott, Emma Frost, Colossus. What's his sister's name? Ileana, Magic, right? And one more. Who's the other one? We got Scott, Colossus, Emma Frost, Magic, and I cannot for the life of me right now remember who the 5th one is, but there's a 5th one. And eventually Scott takes the power from all of them. Because the idea was that they would split it, because the Phoenix Force, the entirety of the Phoenix Force would drive any one of them mad. But if the 5 of them had it, was it Magneto? It might be Magneto. If they split it into the 5, then the Phoenix wouldn't have its full power and wouldn't be able to like destroy the Earth, which is the expectation of what's going to happen, which is why the Avengers are like, we have to do something about this. And in the process of this, he also murders Charles Xavier. So it's the Phoenix Force that does it, but it was his choice to embrace it that led to this. So he's definitely culpable, right? But where I fell in love with the character, and I've done so much thinking about it since then. I read this forever ago. Is that the act of murdering Xavier was not malicious or like evil in a straightforward sense. It was like, for lack of a better term, it was like a trauma response. And as you continue on with his story after Avengers versus X-Men into other stuff, you start to get pieces of this. But I think it was really sort of like during the all new X-Men stuff, when you're sort of comparing him to Scott from back in the day, because all new X-Men is when they bring the X-Men of the past into the present time. And so we had like both versions side by side at times. It sort of put into relief, like stark relief, this idea that Scott had been molded by Charles Xavier, who is not a good guy. But let's be super clear. Patrick Stewart does a very good job of being, Charles Xavier and being this sweet old man. But in the comics, Xavier's a very complex character, much more like the James McAvoy version, who is much more conflicted, much more like prone to, megalomaniacal, egomaniacal decision making. And so, yeah, Xavier, essentially, like, when you put it into context, that Xavier recruited a bunch of teenagers to be his private security force in order to forward his agenda of, human mutant coexistence, which is a good agenda. But he put these children, these teenagers, up against supervillains. And he essentially funded them and gave them their missions and gave them their marching orders and trained them to be soldiers. And Scott was trained to be the leader. And so there is this aspect of the character that people act like Cyclops is a jerk. But from my perspective, Cyclops is not a jerk. Cyclops is shouldering the burden of leadership, and was appointed by Xavier as essentially the savior of an entire race, right? that by leading the X-Men will be the shining example of how mutants can help everyone, mutants and humankind as a whole. And that Scott and Jean, so the original team, Scott, Jean, Beast, Iceman, Bobby, and Warren Worthington Angel, right? The five of them would be this sort of shining example of what mutants, of the potential of mutant kind, and how they could be of benefit to everyone on Earth. But it was Scott's responsibility to lead that team. And again, like we're talking about a teenager, right? Like however you want to figure it out, depending on the interpretation, the interpretation, the iteration, right? Scott is anywhere from like 14 to 16 when he becomes an X-Man. And so you're talking about essentially, let's just say a 15-year-old. You're giving a 15-year-old what is essentially propaganda, right? It's tough because you're sitting there going like, this, like what Xavier wants, his goal is a positive one, and we root for that goal of human and mutant coexistence, but he is doing it at the expense of these children, right? Who he's putting into mortal danger, fighting supervillains like Magneto and the Brotherhood and Mr. Sinister and Apocalypse, right? And so Scott is his poster child for what, human mutant coexistence is supposed to look like. And why wouldn't he be? I mean, him and Jean, right? Like they're both beautiful specimens. Any way you slice it, no matter which iteration you're looking at, that's the case. Which is maybe a little bit Eurocentric. Maybe it's a little bit white supremacist to say that, but I'm just unpacking that right now. I'm just unpacking the statement that I made, and thinking about my own biases and how they've fed into that idea of what I just said. So maybe I disagree with myself. I might disagree with myself, but in any case, I think it's still it actually maybe even makes it more relevant to my point that Xavier kind of puts these two together, and he you kind of get a feeling that he expects the two of them to end up together. He's kind of pairing them that way. I mean, very little of this is actually like directly in the comics, but I think that the interpretation of it, we can look at it and sort of see these things in a modern lens. And now I'm seeing this sort of like, it's interesting that they're all white. Now, obviously, that can be changed, and hopefully the MCU casting does switch that up a little bit. But the X-Men in general, like as a ongoing concern, are very diverse and have characters representing all nations and all cultures, essentially. But at the time, certainly, the X-Men were excessively white. So what does that mean about Xavier? In any case, Xavier is not a good dude. Puts this kid into this position and shoulders him with this impossible responsibility of ending racism, essentially. And I think when you add in the cosmic nature of the Phoenix and the fact that if it is allowed to take a host, it will potentially destroy the entire universe, and Scott having to make a decision about what to do about that, how to handle that, having that responsibility, I think it all just comes to a head, right? And when he has that power and the Phoenix is in him, he does, I think, what he probably often dreamed about, not in a positive way, but just sort of the idle thought of this man who puts all of this responsibility on me and forces me down this path and didn't give me a choice, made me into this soldier, took away any opportunity at a normal life. And so he just to say that he murders Xavier, he destroys every atom of him. With the Phoenix Force, right? So on the one hand, yeah, he does that murderous act is there. You can kind of hand wave it away with the Phoenix Force, but also Scott wanted it in that moment. But then you sort of think about it, you sit back and you look at it and you're like, he's kind of confronting his abuser, isn't he? It's a little bit of a fantasy wish fulfillment scenario of this man that basically traumatized him, and that's where to go back to it. It's like it was like a trauma response, right? And that's where my opinion on Scott Summers, Cyclops as a character, really coalesced into, oh, this guy's my favorite X-Man. This guy's the top of the heap. So Wolverine's cool. I like Iceman sometimes. Cannonball's one of my other favorites. I really, really like Cannonball. I like the Guthries just as a family. I like that within the comics, the Guthries are just all mutants and they're all X-Men at one point or another. There's that whole thing. But I really like Cannonball. Nightcrawler is one of my favorites. Beast is one of my favorites. But at the end of the day, the character I find the most compelling, his journey from start to now, is Scott Summers. It's Cyclops. So in watching X-Men, it's a long road to get all the way back here. I wasn't sure if I'd have enough to constitute an entire episode, but here it is. I would get me talking about Scott Summers, and I'll get there. But coming back to X-Men, the animated series, Scott is all of that stuff that I'm talking about, which is like all of this nuance of the character. If you read the comics, he can be stern and he can be a little bit forceful, and he's a leader, and so he gets flack for it. But he's a well-rounded character, and there's stuff going on. He has like an inner monologue, right? He has like he has something worth saying in the comics, and obviously goes through hell. He goes through hell with the Phoenix, and then Jean coming back resurrected as the Dark Phoenix, and all of that, and his son coming back from the dark future as this dystopian post-apocalyptic Mad Max type warrior, and him having to reconcile that's the fate of his offspring unless he does something about it, which Xavier's like, you better do something about it. There's a lot of nuance in there. In the animated series, there is absolutely zero of it. He is just a jerk through and through, and it's so funny because I think it just really colored our opinion as a generation of this character, because most people's touch point for X-Men was the animated series, and if that's all you knew, then yeah, Scott Summers was just a jerk, just 100%, no quibbling. He was just a jerk. The number of times he just walks into a room and declares that everybody in it is a loser, like in no uncertain terms. Especially like walking into Wolverine's room, and he'll just talk smack on Wolverine constantly, and then like Wolverine will take off and he'll be like, yeah, taking off just like always, and it's like, well, yeah, because you're bullying him, Scott. But without any of that nuance, he is just an ass. Which is funny because then you get to James Marsden's portrayal of Cyclops in the 2.5 movies. The two and a half, that's generous. In the 2 1/8 movies that he's in, and that's including the end of Days of Future Past. He is similarly one note in that. But hey, like, we can talk about Bryan Singer, we can talk about all the writers of the X-Men films at a different time, possibly when another X-Men movie is coming out. We don't need to get into it here, but I mean, I actually, going back and revisiting those X-Men films, the only character that ever gets his complete due is Magneto. Now, Wolverine gets his own spin-off movie, so I'm not going to count that, because Old Man Logan, just Logan, I guess, that is the opportunity for Hugh Jackman's Wolverine to get every piece of nuance, every piece of interesting storytelling fit in there. But I would also say that the Wolverine does a really good job of that as well. The Wolverine's such an underrated film. It falls apart in the third act, but everything in that era was prone to, now we got to fight a big robot, or now we got to go to the top of a tower where there's a giant blue beam. But Magneto is really the only one within the X-Men films themselves, and that's combining the 3 Bryan Singer movies and then the First Class stuff. Right, the First Class forward. Magneto, he really gets a lot. He gets a lot of screen time, especially like the Fassbender one ends up getting a lot of screen time. and a lot of nuance and a lot of interesting stuff, and they're able to do that because they have the backstory of the Singer films to draw off of, so it works. But nobody else really, like, man, we'll talk about like the core X-Men, like Jean kind of get like, but doing Dark Phoenix, I mean, man, they did it twice, and the two times that they did it wrong both times. It's astounding to me that they did it so wrong twice. That he did it so wrong. Bryan Singer himself did it so wrong twice. I don't understand how a director gets a second opportunity like that, especially when he's a dirtbag. But whatever. Considering how much screen time they give to Jean Grey, you'd think that she would have been properly represented, but I don't think that she is. And you know, it just gets worse and worse from there, right? So it's really just those two characters of Magneto and Wolverine that ever get their due. Wolverine for obvious reasons, because he's a franchise unto himself. But yeah, it's just wild to me, and I don't think that anybody has tackled in the mainstream a Cyclops story that makes him a relatable character. Now, they're in the comics. I've just talked to you about the Avengers versus X-Men story, which I think is a very relatable, very understandable perspective on the character. But yeah, the cartoon shows, the movies, they've never given him the opportunity to shine as a character and be complex and nuanced. He is very one note in everything that he's in, which is so unfortunate. It's so unfortunate because he's such a great character. So I'm really hoping that with the MCU stuff that we get an opportunity to see him step out of that and be a much more interesting take on the character. But this is it's our catchphrase this year. We'll just have to wait and see. And X-Men 97, with him being like officially the leader, right? With him coming in and being like, I lead the X-Men, Xavier's gone. Although Magneto coming in and being like, Xavier left everything to me. It's going to be complicated, but that's where we're going to have an opportunity to, I think, see some really good Scott Summers stuff. I hope. That's my hope for it. Hopefully I'm not setting myself up for disappointment, but we'll see soon. We're a week away. So, yeah. I think with that, I'll wrap it up. I was going to talk about video games as well, but I don't think I need to because I have talked for about 45 minutes about Cyclops, I think. Maybe about 40 minutes about Cyclops. But yeah. I love the character. I want to see more from him. I want other people to get to see the things about him that I have come to really appreciate and to understand and respect. I don't know that he ever will, because leaders kind of never get that. When you're the person who's got to make the tough decisions, oftentimes you're reviled for those decisions, good or bad. It doesn't matter. So yeah. We'll just keep hoping. All of us Scott Summers fans, we just keep hoping that eventually he's gonna. I would love to see James Marsden get to come back and play the character again, but I would also love to see. I would love to see them go a different direction with Cyclops in terms of casting. I think there's an opportunity there to cast a wider net and not stay pigeonholed to let's call it the aesthetic. No, I won't beat around the bush. Like he does not have to be a white guy. I think what's important here is that this is not about forced diversity or wokeness or anything like that. What it is for me is it's about finding the right person who can strike the balance between that sort of brash leader quality, but then the charm that you need for that character. I think James Marsden was actually a great choice. I think James Marsden is just now older than he needs to be to play that character. I would like to see the MCU X-Men be teenagers. I would like to see it start from there, but I don't know if that's the direction that they'll go. But that is a topic. Casting the X-Men is a topic for another day, so we'll maybe get around to that at some point, probably post X-Men 97. But yeah, until then, I'll just kind of leave it there. Thank you guys for listening to the podcast. Thank you to our Patreon supporters, of course, for supporting us as you do. We could not do the show without you, so thank you very much. If you want to get, the ThunderQuack podcast early, if you want to get exclusive access to off the record. If you want to get bonus content from all of the podcasts on the ThunderQuack Podcast Network, then you can head to patreon.com/ThunderQuack and you can kick in with your monthly pledge of support, or better yet, do an annual subscription. You will save money and I will save money, because those annual subscriptions, I can then instead of paying month to month for a lot of the things that we have to pay for ThunderQuack, I can just do annual subscriptions, and then it's much easier to budget. It's much easier to know how much money we do and don't have. And I mean, like, then you're locked in for the year. You've bought the content, $54, and you'll get the content all year for 365 days. Which I think ends up benefiting everybody in the end. But I know that you probably are hearing a lot of Patreon requests on podcasts these days. So if you can't support us monetarily, then that's totally fine. But I will ask if you can do me a favor, leave a rating and a review on whatever podcast service you're on, and maybe share it with a friend. Maybe send this over. Hey, do you know another Cyclops fan? Send this to them so that they know that they're not alone. I'm going to reach out right now. I'm just going to reach out with my mind over the internet through time and space to all of you fellow Cyclops fans, and just let you guys know you're not alone. You're not alone. There aren't more of us than anything else. I think that we are few and far between, but there are more of us than people know, I think. So yeah. Thank you guys for listening, and we will see you guys on the next episode. Stay frosty.